Good afternoon, everyone. I see I would like for the room to be fuller when we're presenting the most exciting session. There is a slight change in the order of the presentations. Dr. Sultan Al-Saderi, the Executive Director of the Research Center, was supposed to be here first, but he got held up at another meeting at King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology, so he will be presenting last. Our first presenter is Mr. Andrew Friend. He's a disaster clinical specialist at King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center. Mr. Friend has extensive experience in emergency medical services. He has received multiple international awards from the International Association of Emergency Managers for his work on disaster response and preparedness. He's currently an associate emergency manager through IAEM, which is one of only 3 AEMs in the Middle East and the only one in Saudi Arabia. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Friend to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Ibtisam. Can everybody hear me? My name is Andrew Friend. I'm the Disaster Clinical Coordinator for King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center. A long name, right? 2 long names. I'm also an Associate Emergency Manager with the International Association for Emergency Managers. And today, I'm going to speak with you about, can I get my slides, please? I'm going to speak with you about emergency management, and we're talking specifically disaster management. So, when we're talking about disasters or different emergency situations, they're complex. But why are they so complex? Well, there's a few different reasons we're going to quickly go over. The first one is that they're dynamic. So as you can see here with this picture, this was actually the flood event that occurred in Jeddah a few years back. And when we're speaking about a flood, which is a natural disaster, it's very dynamic. It's going down this street, then it hits a different geographical terrain, goes down this road. It can bust through dams, bust through levees. All kinds of different things can occur. So it's dynamic, it's ever-changing. And that's when we talk about cascading events. So a cascading event is when some sort of disaster occurs and triggers another one. So my favorite case study to talk about is, what is it? The nuclear accident that happened in Japan. If you all remember that, so what did we have? We had a natural disaster, which was an earthquake, which triggered another natural disaster, which was a tsunami, which then impacted the nuclear power plant and caused what we call a technological disaster, or a failure in technology, and caused a nuclear meltdown. That's a prime example of a cascading event. Why else are they complex? It requires coordination. So you're going to be dealing with many different agencies and jurisdictions. So like in the United States, we're dealing with police, fire, we're dealing with the Army National Guard, we're dealing with all kinds of municipalities and local and federal governments. In Saudi Arabia, we're dealing with the MOH, we're dealing with private hospitals, we could be dealing with Red Crescent, a bunch of different agencies that are going to come together and work to respond to the disaster. One of the key issues we see, and we've seen in the United States with responding to disasters, is something called interoperability issues. What does that mean? Can things come together and work together? So if King Faisal Specialist Hospital Ambulance Service has a radio, and they go respond to a big incident in Riyadh with Red Crescent, does their radio work with Red Crescent's radio, right? So that's a good example of interoperability. Another thing we did in the United States is when we implemented it's called the National Incident Management System, which we're going to talk about shortly, is it took away a lot of the problems that we saw, especially during what happened during 9/11. One of the big problems was not only were the communications, it was difficult to communicate with each other, but our language. So in the US, police, fire, ambulance, they all used to use what's called a 10 code. So you'd say 1010, 1024 on scene, all these different things. The problem was they all used different 10 codes. So they went to major events, and they're trying to speak to each other in 10 codes, and you had that mismatch of communication and messages. Finally, we're going to talk about equipment and redundancy. So we're talking about interoperability, and we spoke about communications. So we have this base station over here where all of our radio traffic is going through. What happens if that base station is part of the flood? What happens if it's impacted? Do we have a backup? Is there a redundant system? So when I was just speaking previously, I was talking about the National Incident Management System, and this was a response in the United States to try to put a template across the nation so all different organizations, whether they're state, federal, or even private organizations, could come to an incident or a disaster and work together. Part of that was standardization. So what we implemented was called the Incident Command System on a national level. And that's simply a way to manage disasters, but all the names are the same, terminology is the same, span of control with managing your employees and your different people responding to this is all the same. So if I'm in California or if I'm in Jeddah, I would be able to go to Maine or I'd be able to go to Riyadh and speak the same language and know what my counterparts are doing in the other location. Again, another big movement of this was clear text. So what does clear text mean? We took away the special terminology, took away the 10 codes. I'm on scene. Ambulance 24, I'm on scene instead of ambulance 24, 1010, ambulance 24, 1010, right? Clear text, everyone can understand it. So we've talked about the complexity issues. Why are disasters complex? We talked about kind of a case study, what we kind of did in the United States to try to tackle this and try to control what emergency response is. But now we got to talk about emergency and disaster management as a whole. So the key things with emergency and disaster management is you have to look at all the different types of disasters. So we have the natural disaster. So we spoke about the flood in Jeddah, or we spoke about the tsunami in Japan. We've got man-made disasters, which could be acts of terrorism, or even warfare is considered that. And then there's another third one that I like to talk about, which is technological, which is the failure of a technology that triggers a cascading event and makes a disaster. As a matter of fact, we had a technological disaster in Riyadh maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I was here. And what happened is we had a fuel truck that got in a car accident with another car. The fuel truck overheated, and it caused what's called a Blevy explosion. And then it made a massive fireball, and a lot of people were injured and killed. That's an example. We had a truck driving, it crashed. We had the failure of technology on that truck to release the gas, and then it caused an explosion. So we've got the disasters. Now we got to talk about the phases of emergency management, which is never ending. So we've got preparedness. Preparedness is what we're doing right now. I'm here talking to you about emergency management, sharing with you best practices. That's preparedness. Writing emergency plans, that's preparedness. The next thing you got to do is work on mitigation. Mitigation is taking any kind of action to lessen the impact. Okay, we know disaster X is going to occur. What systems can we put in place to mitigate or lessen the impact? Just like if we're expecting floods, what kind of drainage or dam or levee systems can we put in place to take the flood water and channel it so it doesn't cause a lot of damage? Response, which is the most famous part because that's the part everyone sees, right? The public doesn't really care about preparedness or maybe mitigation, but they care about response because when they see on CNN or BBC or Saudi Channel 2 News, they see there's this disaster, oh, and then everyone gets really excited about it. We got to respond. But what they don't know is a lot of the work is already started in the preparedness and mitigation phase. So the response is simply you're putting together all these actions to save lives. Finally, the recovery phase, or what I like to call the forgotten phase, because it's out of the public eyes, and recovery can take days, weeks, months, years, a decade, right? Hurricane Katrina, they're still recovering from Hurricane Katrina, if you'd believe that. And it's out of the public eyes, they forget about it. So the key thing here is that this is a never-ending cycle of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery, and it never ends. It always goes around in a circle, you always prepare. So why did I bring that up? Well, when you go home to your healthcare organizations or your different businesses, this can be utilized for a hospital, ambulatory care, a business, STC, any kind of business you could think of should have some sort of emergency planning. And that's the key word here, planning. You've got to involve all stakeholders. It's not just a one guy or a one gal show sitting in an office writing the plan and then khalas, that's it. No. You got to bring together. So for the hospital, we bring together engineering, facility management, infection control, quality, ER, paramedics, communications, supply chain, all these to come together and say, brainstorm. What do we need to do to prepare? Finally, you got to get that buy-in, which I'm going to touch on in a second here. So, how do we start a comprehensive emergency management program? How do you start it at your location? I'm going to give you my keys to success and what I've replicated around the world when I go to work and do emergency management, and this is how I always approach it. Step one, we've got to know what our hazards are, we've got to know what our weaknesses are, and we've got to take action. So we conduct what's called a HIRA, a Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. Now the key here is, one, this is a very high-level risk assessment. And the common pitfall I see is they'll take the event that occurs the most and then go, okay, that's the number one threat. We got to plan and mitigate and prepare for it. You got to take all your different threats and hazards that occur, okay? And then you've got to measure, are we vulnerable to this? And if our organization is vulnerable to this, what's the risk to our assets? What's the damage? And that will help you decide as you're writing your emergency plan and as you're spending money, Saudi riyals, US dollars, British pounds, whatever it is, on your mitigation projects, you could put it to the different categories that impact the most. That's going to be the most fruitful, right? So one of the famous things I like to refer to since we're in Saudi is I see a lot of times people identify sandstorms. They happen every year. We know we're going to happen, so that's our number one threat. But what you got to realize is that our HVAC units, the units that suck air into the buildings, they all have filters. We have weather stripping on all the doors and windows. So although that threat occurs all the time, we're not vulnerable to it, and the damage to our assets not that much. Next, so we've done our HIRA. Next, we got to do our what's called an emergency operations plan, okay? What this is an all hazards approach. This is another pitfall to emergency management I see all the time. I'll go somewhere and I'll see an emergency plan, and it will have either one plan with a section for every type of disaster they can think of, or they'll have a separate plan for every different type of disaster they can think of, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30. I mean, you can use your imaginations. We can think of a lot of disasters, right? The key here is that you have one comprehensive, all hazards approach plan. It needs to be simple and clear to understand. It's not a dissertation. You're not writing it for a doctorate. It needs to be simple, easy to understand, clear, and concise. Finally, layered. So what we did at King Faisal is we had it in a layered approach. So we have our main plan up here, which I like to call the mother plan, okay? So for our organization, it's about 60, 70 pages. So that's our mother plan. That's used for preparedness and to get to know our organization. The next one down is in actually every ward, every patient care area, we have a yellow binder. So for us, a code yellow is an external disaster sending patients into the organization. So we have that code yellow binder that every ward will open up. So if a disaster occurs, they're not reading 60 pages, they're not reading policies and procedures, they're pulling their yellow folder, setting it on the table, opening it. Most cases for departments, it's 1 to 2 pages, checklist. And then the third layer is what's called an action card. And we actually have a laminated action card inside for all the key positions in that area that they can put on, and then it walks them through the emergency response process. So what we're doing is taking something that's very big, and if you think about it from a high level, there's a lot of things that go into emergency response, and we're breaking it down for the end users so it's easy to understand, clear, concise, and they can actually follow it in a disaster. Incident command system. So we spoke about the incident command system, but here's some key terminology from the incident command system. So there's two types of bodies that we have when we respond to a disaster. We have what's called the EOC, which for us, it's all our key leadership of the hospital, and they come together in a room, and they provide logistical support for the response. Whereas the ICP, or the incident command post, that's an example of our incident command post. That's a portable post they set up as close to the disaster as safe as possible. Their whole role is operational to save lives. When they need something, they call the emergency operations center. Hey, we need 5 generators. We need 10 nurses. We need some floodlights and XYZ. The EOC facilitates it. So you have on-scene oversight, and then you have the oversight providing the logistical support and guidance. And then they can also work with external agencies called mutual aid. So for here, that might be Saudi Red Crescent or Civil Defense, something like this. Finally, so we've prepared, we've done the HIRA. From that, we've put in mitigations. We know what our threats are, so maybe we put some access control, maybe we built some dams, maybe we got some N95 masks, maybe we got some supplies. Okay, so we planned preparedness, and then we responded with the incident command system, and now we've got to recover and continue. That's COOP, continuity of operations. The disasters occurred, we've saved the lives. Now, what do we have to do to keep our operations going, right? We're in a hospital, or if we're in a car, if I'm Chrysler and I'm the CEO, how quickly can we start making cars? How quickly can we return to operations? Can we create 100% of our production, 50%, right? So that's what continuity of operations is all about. Having a way to where you can continue operations in a limited fashion until you can return to full capability. Finally, train. Education, awareness, is the keystone, it's the cornerstone to any emergency management program. Without it, all you have is a bunch of documents sitting on a shelf somewhere, or we're in the digital age, sitting on a computer somewhere, right? And then nobody cares. So train, education and awareness. What's the next step? So we've brought this back, we've put in these different plans, we follow these different practices, but how do I know if what I'm doing is right? Maybe I'm brand new. Maybe I'm new to this position or don't have a lot of experience. What works around the world? Well, fortunately for the rest of the world, but unfortunately for the US, is we have a ton of disasters. Turn on the news. Hurricane, earthquake, fire, flood, whatever it is. So we've had a lot of time to respond and learn lessons. We've learned a lot of big lessons in disaster response. What EMAP is, it's an emergency management accreditation program, and it's accreditation only for emergency management or what we call disaster management, right? And it's based off best practices from around the world, and it will help guide you on this process. And I'm happy to announce that we are actually pursuing this, and inshallah, if and when we receive it, we'll be the first hospital in the world with this accreditation. Other companies are like the CDC, Amtrak, things like this. Finally, the number one problem with every emergency manager, security manager, any kind of manager is funding and buy-in, right? So for me as an emergency manager, how do I go to, okay, let's say it this way. Decision makers a lot of times, whether it's a state or a business, maybe elected official, maybe appointed, maybe they're an expert in this, but they're not familiar with emergency response, they're not familiar with security, they're not familiar with this, but they're your key decision maker, the ones that you have to convince to get your funding or to get your support to do your project. So I was facing this problem a lot, which is a common problem. And I actually created this model called the Diamond and Iceberg model. It was published. And basically what this is an easy way to explain to people the value of preparedness and mitigation, okay? Let me quickly explain it to you. So if you see the shock line that goes across, that's where the disaster occurs, okay? Everything before is before disaster. Everything after is post-disaster. On the top of the diamond, you see how it's uniformed, but it's larger. That represents resources for mitigation and preparedness. Resources could be training, monetary, staff, preparedness. As you see, after the disaster, post-shock, it's very uniformed in a smaller footprint. Now, if you go over to the iceberg, who here has heard that when iceberg, you only see roughly 10% of it above the water? Have you guys heard that? Yeah, he's heard that back there. Well, that's the same here. Roughly, only about 10% of the total footprint is before the disaster. And what that represents is not adequate mitigation or preparedness before a disaster occurs. And as you can see, post-shock, it's huge, it's jagged, it goes different ways. And that represents a big footprint. We're talking monetary, we're talking continuity of operations, so you remember COOP. We're talking loss of life, and we're talking physical damage to your assets. So, as you leave here today and journey back to your home, I want you to decide and help your leaders decide, should your organization be a diamond or an iceberg? Thank you.